Wasn't it said that a pastor who had gone to the Cox's house to pray had seen a bucket of water come to boil in the presence of the young woman? Wasn't it true that prayer books had flown out of the pews during a religious service that Esther attended? Esther's health began to deteriorate. For her own well-being, her family decided to send her to Sackville, New Brunswick for 2 weeks to visit a sister who lived there. Nothing strange happened during her convalescence, either in Amherst or Sackville. Things began to look up. Was Esther Cox's illness the devil's work? Hope soon faded. Esther went back to Amherst at the end of the month, and the strange occurrences started up again at 6 Princess Street. Lit matches appeared out of thin air, falling from the ceiling. Fires, which were quickly put out, began to ignite spontaneously throughout the house. No one could sleep anymore. Fearing for his family's lives, Daniel Teed knew that Esther had to leave the house.
They felt it wasn't safe to keep Esther in the house any longer because fires were being started and knives were flying around, and they had 2 small boys. So she went to live with John White and his wife. And at first, John ran a place called White's Saloon, and he would go off to work and Esther would be left alone with Mrs. White. Well, eventually things started, she'd have Esther scrubbing the floor and the scrub brush would disappear and then fall down almost on their heads.
Pursued, Esther returned to her family home on Princess Street. Her arrival was met with a resurgence of bizarre incidents, which were now being reported in all of the newspapers throughout Nova Scotia.
Walter Hubble heard about the story of Esther Cox, I assume through the newspapers. He was a well-known actor from the U.S., and he came up to see for himself what actually was happening. The interesting thing is that Walter was only here in Amherst for a few weeks, but he did arrange to live at the home. He arranged to, as a paying boarder, to stay there. He saw these things happen to Esther, and he slowly convinced Esther and her family to arrange to allow him to take her on the road and show these experiences on the stage to a variety of communities in the area.
Walter Hubble was secretly hoping that Esther's invisible companion would show his nasty side to the spectators.
Sometimes they were disappointed because nothing would happen. Other times they would hear knocking and banging and would be very excited by the idea that Esther had something happening to her on the stage while he did this.
Unfortunately for him, the undertaking proved to be futile. In 1908, he wrote a book on the strange events that happened to Esther Cox called The Great Amherst Mystery.
As a playwright, I'm sure he had a flair for the dramatics, but he made very sure that he factually outlined all the events as they took place and as they were witnessed. And actually, the book, which he entitled The Great Amherst Mystery, which is where the name, of course, came from, his book has a number of the witnesses in town to give credibility to what the story is.
Things weren't any better for Esther Cox when she got back to Amherst.
The thing that makes this story so interesting, once again, is the fact that it wasn't a house that was haunted, but rather a person. And wherever Esther went, the ghost would follow. When knives started flying around the house, they needed to do something because not only was Esther in jeopardy, but now the whole family was. So they eventually tried to farm her out to other places that she could go stay. And she went to this one house, and she wasn't there very long, and she started working in the barn to earn her keep. And the barn caught on fire. Eventually, Esther was charged with arson. The barn burnt down, and she was jailed.
Esther was actually sentenced to 4 months in jail, but got out, I think, after a month because of good behavior, and I think people felt sorry for her because they believed her story. But while she was in jail, a man from Spring Hill started to visit her. They formed a relationship, and when she got out of jail, she married this gentleman.
Esther Cox married a man, a certain Mr. Adams. Amazingly, the wedding ceremony coincided with the disappearance of the ghost of Amherst, who had made Esther's life a living hell for 2 years.
After that incident, the ghost seemed to stop. And just as unexpectedly as it started with no reason, it stopped in the same way.